I, for one, am really excited for the release of the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. Having played games recently like Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Last of Us Part 2, I'm already blown away by graphics. They're getting to the point of almost looking photorealistic, and the fact that we're going to have consoles with the capability of things such as ray tracing, and just the fact that they'll look and play better than they already currently do, it's staggering at how phenomenal the technology is becoming. And it is really interesting when you look back at the past of gaming, and the evolution of quality seems to rise on an exponential scale. And one thing that I think is an interesting discussion to have as we approach the release of this new technology and these new consoles is what games I think should get some form of remake or remaster, or even just a port to these next generation consoles. So this is not going to be my only video. I was just going to do this one video where I listed off all the games that I want to see get a remake on the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X. That list, I think, is a little bit too long, and I didn't think it was fair to any of the entries to just condense them to a bullet point, because I'd like to explain why I think it deserves a remake or a remaster. And I'm sure that some of my entries will get a little bit of backlash, just because people might say it's not retro enough or that's not old enough. My perspective is because we are moving forward to, we're two console generations ahead now of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. And there are so many games that have kind of slipped into that tier of becoming classics, even though they may not seem super old yet. But I don't know. For me personally, games that are pre-2010, I think could be considered in the running for some kind of update on these next generation consoles. Now, just to differentiate the difference between what a remaster and a remake is, a remaster, the pitch for it generally doesn't do this, but the pitch for a remaster is that it's some kind of graphical overhaul. So they take the current build of an Xbox 360 game, for example, and then they will put it on the Xbox One, and the major change is that it will run in 1080p resolution instead of 720p. So it's a clearer image. It looks a little better, and occasionally they'll maybe make some minor adjustments, like maybe they'll change up the contrast a little bit. Now, what they could do is they could update textures and add models and really make it the best self of that game. Generally, they don't do that, and I believe that's out of fear of changing the experience or the aesthetic too much and taking the fans off. And I don't know, even though I do consider them lazy and almost more of ports than remasters, I do understand the appeal, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with them. I wouldn't say that there's any harm in them. It gives us players the opportunity to re-experience those games on current generation consoles, and it allows those companies to get a pretty good piece of revenue for a game that they don't have to put too much work into. So, it's something that I absolutely understand why it happens, but I look at something like BioShock the Collection, for example, and do I like that I can play it on my Xbox One and PS4? Absolutely. But I also maintain the attitude that I think it would have been interesting had these games been updated to look like current-gen games. And that's not to say that the games look bad. They still look incredible. However, the textures are aging. The first game is from 2007. It's an aging game, and the remaster didn't do too much in the way of doing much of a graphical overhaul. So, it's not that it doesn't look better or that it doesn't look good as it is. My point is that some of these games almost deserve a remake rather than just a remaster, where, either they go in and completely do an overhaul of the textures and the models in the game, or they just rebuild it from the ground up. We've seen this with games like Final Fantasy VII. We have also seen this with some of the Resident Evil games. And so in today's video, I'd like to talk about a game that I think should heavily be considered for a remake, and I think that this is a great candidate because not only would it be good on its own and sell on its own, but it could actually kick off a franchise. So before Assassin's Creed was huge, Ubisoft's big cash cow for historical sword fighting, combat was Prince of Persia. And this is something where if you followed my channel long enough, you know that I'm a big Prince of Persia fan. And I still maintain that the best Prince of Persia game is The Sands of Time from 2003. It's kind of like Spider-Man 2, where it like surprisingly holds up for its age on pretty much every level except graphically. Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, you could not fool someone that it was a modern game, though, both because of the graphics, And also just because the narrative and the cutscenes are outdated. And that's why I don't just feel that this game should get a new coat of paint. I feel that if this game were rebuilt from the ground up, I think that there would be something really special here. And that's what it would require. You could not just slap new textures on this game. Even if you replaced every texture in the game, it would still look old just because the models look old. Now, this would not be a hard remake to do, especially if you followed a similar format and formula to the first game. The first game was not a very long game. I believe it was probably 6 to 8 hours to complete. It was very linear, and it's a pretty basic story. It's you fighting a bunch of monsters. There's a princess and a big, mustache twirling bad guy. But if they updated this plot a little bit, updated the cutscenes, rewrote it to some degree, and they could even bring back the original voice actors. I mean, Yuri Lowenthal, the current voice of Spider-Man, was actually the prince in this game. So they could bring back the original cast. They could bring back a new cast, just depending on what they wanted to do. But I feel that this was a really revolutionary game for its time. It's one of the first games that was not only a really great narrative, but also really pushed the 3D platforming. We saw other franchises do this as well, such as Zelda, but Prince of Persia is almost the unsung hero of platforming. It's kind of crazy because with games like Jedi Fallen Order, I play them, and people rave about the platforming, or Uncharted for that matter. And then I go back and play, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, and to me, it almost is a more polished and fun experience from a gameplay perspective. And I feel that this could really pioneer remakes as well. It could be a nice addition to things like the Resident Evil remakes. And the platforming, like I said, is still so fun that if they just added one or two mechanics, if they just polished it up, made it feel, maybe a bit less clunky, because it has aged. And I know that I'm coming off as sounding like I'm maybe giving this game too much credit, but for what it's worth, this game has aged, but it has aged pretty well. With that, the mechanics don't necessarily feel super outdated. Now, could they be, again, polished? Absolutely. And I guess that's why, things like Jedi Fallen Order frustrated me a little bit, is because somehow that platforming felt even less polished than this game, which is from 2003. Now, the other reason that I think that this game should be considered for a remaster is, like I mentioned, there's a lot of franchise potential here. The Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was pretty much heralded as a masterpiece. It's kind of the unsung hero now because Ubisoft let the franchise die. But back in the day, it was a huge contender for, people's favorite game of all time, for people's favorite platforming game of all time. And what ended up happening was they made a sequel, The Warrior Within, and nobody really liked it because it felt like they forgot what made the first game so good. They kind of went in a really bizarre direction and tried to be as edgy as possible. Their third game kind of felt like they were still trying to be really edgy, but were also trying to offer an apology to the people who didn't like the second game, and so it ended up being this weird mashup of tones that a lot of people took issue with, even though it did. Conceptually, I think all these games are really cool. It's a really cool time travel narrative. Really well thought out, if I'm being honest. Even, I wasn't a huge fan of The Warrior Within, but with that said, I still think that from a conceptual standpoint, there's a lot of really great ideas there, a lot of really great lore that I think could be re-explored. And if they were to kick off a new trilogy based off of this remake, they could exchange a lot of ideas. They could look at the concepts that work and put them in a more fitting tone for the character. And I just think that this would be a really great opportunity for Ubisoft to bring back this franchise. And if you're marketing it as a remake, I don't think people will expect it to be, like a completely different game than the original. Like you look at the Final Fantasy or the Resident Evil remakes, and even though the games have been completely rebuilt from the ground up, they still take the concepts and a lot of the gameplay elements that people loved about those originals. And I think that that's what this one could do. I don't think that people would be demanding a giant open world. Though they could certainly add some kind of hub world for this castle that you're in. Ultimately, I think that it's a great game. If you haven't played the original game, I believe it's pretty cheap on Steam. They're always doing sales with it. You can play it on your Xbox One via backwards compatibility. So I do recommend it if you're if you got nothing better to do and you just want to play a fun, swashbuckling, kind of old game, I think go for it. So like I said, I will have a lot more of these videos in the coming weeks and months where I will discuss other games that I think should get remakes and or remasters for this next generation of consoles. I'm really excited to see what we get, and ultimately it's inconsequential if we actually get these. This is kind of more just a wish list and things that I think would be cool to see. Ultimately, my main focus will be on new games. I'm very excited to see what the roster is, not only for launch titles, but within the next 2-3 years, what we will end up seeing from these companies. But thanks you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And in the comments, let me know, what games do you want to see get a remake or remaster? And thanks you guys again so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.